Thank you, David, for joining us. This is the latest episode of my new podcast, Bolt Cutter. Um, it's interesting because David is maybe one of the only people on the internet who's more critical of China, the Chinese government, than I am. Um, that said, I'm going to try and avoid this being just only China bad podcast because I want to try ask David as well where he thinks there is a genuine challenge in some technological fields, etc. I'm also really interested in learning from David. Some of the recent rumors and the things that we're learning out of China regarding purges in the PLA, which is really interesting, especially when it comes to potentially Xi, his consolidation of power. How it's very interesting. I know David's been talking about this recently. So yeah, David, thank you so much for joining.
Hey, Drew, thanks so much for having me. I've been following you for a while, and I love the work that you do. And it's something that I don't think most people have the courage to do. So I appreciate you having me on.
No, thank you, man. Well, I wanted to start actually. So you are from Shandong province in China, and you were born there. Tell me. So I'm interested. How did you become such a critic of the Chinese government? Like, sort of like, what was that process for you? Because it's obviously very interesting. And your tagline on your show is "You tell bad news about China," sort of thing. And obviously, like, that's quite rare. That's quite rare to have somebody whose family background is Chinese, but is very, very critical of the Chinese government in such a public and loud way. So I'm interested. What was that process for you? How did you come to like become such a loud critic of the Chinese government?
Yeah, so well, I left the country when I was 11, and my childhood really it wasn't like it wasn't like a North Korean type of living situation where we couldn't afford food, but it was you knew that certain things couldn't be said in China, like about the stuff that what I talk about now, I lived through that stuff, but when I think the period like so growing up, right, I wasn't quite into politics. I don't think any 13, 14-year-old teenage boy would be into politics. But when
Yeah.
when 2020 happened, when the pandemic happened, that was when I and along with many other people started to kind of see China and see the government in a different sort of perspective. And also I was always aware of the type of country that China was because my parents were, they were very kind of they love watching like news about China too. So I had that like kind of environment. But 2020 was really the turning point for me. And then I came to the United States in 2020, and I worked and I interned for a bit in news, and then. Fast forward to 2022, I had the opportunity to basically do a YouTube channel. So it's kind of an interesting thing because I met up with a group of people who are quite knowledgeable on China. And I learned a lot from them while I was in the US since 2020. So I really, it kind of like clicked with me that this might be something that I want to do. So long story short, I basically started something that I thought would be interesting because part of my background is the fact that I can read and write Chinese and I
Yeah.
understand Chinese. So I was in the beginning, I was almost like I just communicated with the group that I knew and basically just talked about what no other channel, or at least a few other channels, were doing. Only a few other channels. And then I think I also found that it was unique because you said something that was interesting, that I'm kind of more critical than you are even of the Chinese government, because I'm actually not that quite critical in
Yeah.
the general space of the Mandarin speaking sort of YouTube population, right? You can find a lot of channels talking bad mouthing about China. So
Yeah.
but in the English space, I would say I'm quite on that extreme case. Now I usually say that this whole idea about talking bad about China, it wasn't really my own slogan. Actually, it was
Yeah.
a lot of the troll army comments that I get. They're like, all you do is talk bad about China. So I was like, let me just use that as my tagline because I felt like that's actually how they see me. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's pretty funny. But in general, like just doing YouTube and now like trying to focus more on like Twitter or X and other social media platform, I just find it like it almost feels like, especially among the younger people, that there's a really divided sort of view of China. And I think, unfortunately, there's a lot work to be done, which I think we can talk in more details. But in general, I think it really clicked with me that this is what I want to do, and this is something that I'm kind of proficient at doing. So that's basically how I started.
Yeah, look, that's really interesting. Could you tell us more about like that group, like how you came to sort of like would you describe it as like a gradual process, your criticism of the Chinese government sort of thing, or was it like it was like a moment that clicked? I'm interested.
Yeah, so for me, it was it's hard to explain actually, but it's so I read a few books when I grew up about China. I don't know if you've heard of them. One is the it's called Nine Commentaries on the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh
I
yeah,
read the Naked Communist. Cleon Skelton, obviously, like him and his son, uh, Paul Skelton, who later like talked a lot about the American Constitution. But the Naked Communist was a big one. I read a book. The Nine Commentary was also a big one. But it essentially was something that I felt like I was just it interested me. But also it felt like it was something that as a Chinese person I felt I had a responsibility to do. Because my mission right now to really like it's not a grand mission, but it's almost like I want to amplify the voice of people in mainland China who don't get a voice, especially
mm,
into the English speaking world. Because I feel like so to tell you the answer about the group, it's basically a bunch of Chinese immigrants who some of them are like doctors and some of them are
yeah,
professors, but they kind of just immigrated to the West and you know they obviously had a lot of experience living in China. They study this kind of stuff as the hobby, so we just kind of got to know each other. They're much
yeah,
older than I am, so I'm almost like their apprentice in a sense.
mm,
But yeah, it's just a group of uncles and mostly older dudes, but we get along, and I learned a lot from them about the history of China. There are some people who lived through like the Cultural Revolution. There's people who
yeah,
lived through the 1989 democracy, Tiananmen Square protests. So a lot of that is just kind of lived through experience, and to hear from them, right? And they know a lot of the other groups, human rights groups as well. So through them, I learned a lot, and I kind of gained this sort of a revelation about the CCP in general, which is I think is something that's quite poisonous to the Chinese population.
yeah.
So I felt like that was my sort of mission.
No, that's really interesting. I actually kind of relate to that because it's sort of funny. Like when I started as an activist, I was only like 19, 20. It was in 2019. I like held a pro Hong Kong rally at the
Mm,
University of Queensland, and like the Little Pinks came out and tried to like bash me up and everything. And I was really lucky because like I'd never even really set out to be an activist or anything, but straight away I met people like Clive Hamilton in Australia,
mm,
and quite a few sort of like older professors and people who've been like who spent decades basically like talking about the party and criticizing the party, and like they put me onto some like really good books and all that sort of stuff, and I learned a lot that same way. So yeah, you always need mentorship. I'm
yeah.
wondering, like, you were talking as well about like the sort of troll brigades that you do get. So have you ever encountered like direct threats? How has the online abuse been for you? Has your family been threatened? I mean, like, I assume you must have some family still, back home. Like, yeah, what's that experience been for you? Because I have had like some pretty crazy times, with like just thousands of death threats and all this crazy
Yeah.
stuff. Like, you really encounter like the hardcore nationalists, etc.
I think so. That's why I don't sort of put myself up on there in terms of like what I actually do, right? Because I know like people like you guys, you put yourself actually in physical dangers in a lot of times. And I know in Australia,
Not so
like
much
I've
anymore. Not so much anymore, man. Because
yeah,
like honestly, the funny thing is, I'm kind of like trying to like move more into like YouTube and online stuff
yeah,
because
yeah,
uh, I don't know. You must have seen like back in the day, like 2022, they targeted me and they
yeah,
created like a bomb threat against me, and
yeah,
like
yeah,
basically my family were like, no more in-person protesting, please. And I was like, okay, I'll
yeah.
do like sort of like less the physical stuff. But that's how I started. Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, you go on. Yeah.
No. That's why like I kind of knew the danger of that to begin with. So
Yeah.
I try not to disclose much, even like on podcasts and stuff about my personal information, for the
Yeah. Of
sake that
course.
like even in China, like I don't think they don't know my real name, so they don't really know who I am. At least I don't think they do. But
Yeah.
then also I think here's a really important thing which again I think it's really important for Chinese people to understand. It's that if you don't fear the regime, they can't get to you. They can
Mm,
try to like so the whole thing with the CCP's terror is the fact
yeah.
that they can scare you, right? They can use these
Yeah.
scare tactics like bomb threats and whatnot. And when you cave, they realize that you're scared of them, and that's when they know they're successful. So for me, I'm just not afraid.
Yeah.
Like, but I also know that there's the safety aspects as well. So I think no, like I haven't gotten any direct threat. I've gotten like one death threat email, but it was kind of written like I feel like it was written by a 16-year-old guy in his basement, that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
So which is I think pretty good. I hope it stays that way, but I don't I don't feel like I want to draw that kind of attention. But I also think that like if you take enough safety precaution, I think it's okay. But also I believe like at the end of the day, I'm not there yet in terms of the impact. I'm sure if I grow a little bit more, maybe I'll get more attention from the Ministry of State Security. So that that might be a goal that I want to work towards.
It's actually like pretty scary. Hey, like I've got so many friends in this space. Like it's crazy because even in Australia,
Yeah.
this is the funny thing, right? Like America, I think takes the threat so much more serious. Like
Mm.
America has like straight up arrested people from the Ministry of
Yeah.
State Security. Like they actually foil these plots and everything. Whereas like in Australia, I know so many guys, and they're just like anonymous people. Like they may have attended a protest 1 or 2 times, but like they're not big online. They're not like sort of like public actors or whatever.
Yeah.
But even these guys, like they get the terror tactics, like cars idling outside their homes. Yeah, and then like in 2023, it was pretty crazy. Like I'm still like shocked that it wasn't a bigger story in Australia, but essentially, like the Australian Federal Police told me that they had foiled they had intercepted a foreign interference plot. They wouldn't directly tell me that it was China, but they told me that they had like intercepted a foreign interference plot against me. And basically, it was part of a campaign to try find my address, violently, like physically harm me, etc. So I assume like kidnapping or worse, and they said, oh, we actually raided individuals as a result of this, and I was like, oh my god, can I like talk to the media? Can I release this information publicly? And then they put so much pressure on me not to. Like they were saying,
Wow.
they were saying, don't go to the press. Don't even tell your lawyer. Don't even tell your family. Like at the time, I was still living with my family. I'm living on my own now, but like at the time, I was still living with my family. They were telling me I couldn't even tell my family that there had been a direct attempt to like find my address and harm me. And I actually like ended up sitting on the information for like almost a full year, not even disclosing it. And in the end, I only went public because I found out that Vicky Xu in Australia, who was also like a very like I guess she did even more damage to the Chinese government. She did the big report on like the Uyghur forced labor and the supply chains, etc. And they went insane against her. Like just massive hate campaigns, just constantly blanketing the internet. But they also target. I found out that the same thing had happened to her. She'd been called in by the police at the same time, told her almost the same details. And so we realized that it was actually like kind of it must have been an interconnected thing. And of course, it had to have been China because she was targeted in the exact same way. And that's when we went public. But yeah, like it got like one news story in Australia and no one really cared about it at all. And it was like kind of a shame because I'm like, that's a bad thing that like they actually had to raid somebody because of like a kidnap plot. But no one seemed to care. I mean, in Australia, it's really like the vibe in Australia is really like get back to business with China, just get back to usual, get back to normal, pre-COVID, all that sort of stuff. And yeah, like, but it's scary because like that's the reality. Actual kidnap plots. I'm jealous of you because in America, like they just arrest these people. Like they arrest these people, they sentence them to prison. There are court cases. There are really high profile court cases in America about like, espionage and that lady who was working in the New York governor's office and stuff like that. But in Australia, like they intercept this stuff, they foil it, but it's like they try and keep it out of the news, which is like a shame because I think then it means that people don't realize the full extent of it.
So you talk about such an important thing because like take organ harvesting for example. It was the New York Times was talking about it. The Washington Post they were all doing stories on it in the early 2000s, and then it just went silent, right, for a decade. And then until the Uyghur stuff, like the concentration camp persecution stuff, came out, then it started to gain mainstream attraction again. The thing is, like, I feel like Australia, the European countries too, like, I feel like the CCP spends a lot of money there just to say that, like, you don't have to criticize, not criticize us, but just don't talk about certain things. And it just feels like, like it feels like there's almost like a need, like I wouldn't call it a need of these news media because I feel like they still kind of, or at least I believe they still serve the people of the country. But I do believe that, like, for them, because China is such a distant sort of thing to them, that they're like, hey, if I touch something sensitive, like, could that be harmful to my business, that kind of. So I feel like China puts so much pressure on the media space too,
That's why what you're doing is really good and so important.
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope more people like. I mean, you know, you do your thing and get up onto that digital space, right? Because I
Yeah.
think like so, me and a few other China YouTuber were just talking about this issue too. We're up against an entire state machine, right? Like
Yes.
you're probably aware of those like YouTube channels that do like the propaganda tour of Chinese,
Um,
places,
y-
right? And then say,
yeah,
ah,
and
look, the trains and all that. Like we're up against such a big machine
it
that
is.
it's
Yeah.
difficult. And so it's like if you have more people joining this type of stuff, like it's good. And like there's so much I can do during a day, right? Like I make one video a day, or every 2 3 days I make a video. Like
Yeah.
you can't match their speed. So in
And you've
that
got
sense,
millions of
it's
people. Yeah. They literally have millions of
you
people.
need that you need that to fight this public opinion warfare. And I say that, like, go for it. But honestly, like what you went through and what Vicky went through and what a lot of the activists go through, I just wish there was some sort of a medium in which their story got more traction,
I
because
wish.
traditional
Yeah.
media, they just simply won't do a big story on it, right? But like
Yeah.
we don't have the influence yet to put it out there. So it's just I think it's such a tragedy too, because like there's so many, like I've had people reach out to me from like Hong Kong that say, hey, can I do an interview with you? I'm just like, you know what, I even if I want to do one with you, that topic just doesn't get enough traction, doesn't get enough views. There's like it's like, yeah, I do one, and you get like 10,000 views.
Yeah. It's
It
hard.
doesn't it's not effective. And so like frankly speaking, a lot of times a lot of the important topics, like even when I do a video on organ harvesting, it doesn't get as much view, because like
Yeah.
you just simply don't have that structure there to support it. And I think that's a shame.
Dude, it's really hard. And like coming back to your point earlier where you were talking about like we're up against like, yeah, such an organized campaign, and
Mhm.
and really the online media space is pretty dominated by these voices that are seemingly pretty pro-China. I think that's especially the case with TikTok, social media.
Yeah.
I think the sad thing is social media now is getting just really, really blanketed with pro-China stuff. And I
Yeah.
think one of the best examples of this recently was I Show Speed in China.
Yeah.
And it's funny because like there were a couple times where sort of like there were probably things in his tour that were obviously like not planned, that don't show China in a good light, right? Do not tell the China story well. That being, for example, like the incidents of racism, and you showed that as
Yeah.
well. Like there were a couple times where like there was actually some pretty like really messed up racism targeting him, like people calling him racial slurs, like people giving him bananas,
Yeah.
like KFC, like there was some pretty bad stuff there. And it's interesting because like that does show like there's racism in Chinese society. But I was gonna say like overall though, I was looking at the iShow Speed tour and I was like, this is the best propaganda I've seen coming out of China in like decades, man. Because the
Yeah.
funny thing is, right, a lot of the time I do find that their sort of like online propaganda campaigns and stuff can be pretty sort of like ham-fisted.
Yeah.
Like if you compare it to Russia, I think like Russia has much more sophisticated Russian propaganda. Because like when I look at the Russian propagandists, a lot of the time, like they don't go out and try to say like Russia's the best country in the world.
Yeah.
Their kind of strategy is more like, we might be shit, but your country's just as shit. And
Mm.
you shouldn't trust anything. You shouldn't believe in anything. Whereas like the China propagandists will often go out and be like, China is like 5,000 years ahead of the West. And like, they'll say stuff that like you can kind of see through it as propaganda. But I Show Speed, like just watching that, I was like, no, this is actually really effective. I
Yeah.
actually couldn't believe that the party had gotten out of its own way for once. And like they were letting just like, crowds of young people walk through the street.
Yeah.
And so I was like, because we both know like the public security, it's so tight in China. You've posted videos where there'll be a one-person protest and they immediately bring out those massive blue
Yeah.
walls and stuff like that. They're so sensitive about like, public gatherings and stuff like that. So to have all these young, like, internet savvy youth just walking through the streets, hundreds of people at a time, like ordinarily you'd think they wouldn't allow that sort of stuff. But they got out of their own way for once. And, they had like minders and they had minders with them, etc. They did really well. Like they unfortunately had a really, really good propaganda tour. And then there are now like millions and millions of young people who watch that and like, wow, China is like 50 years ahead of us in terms of technology. Like it was pretty amazing propaganda. Tell us a bit more about like the iShow Speed stuff.
So what you mentioned is actually a really important point, because I believe back in October or maybe November of last year, there was so what I heard was that in the CCP, there was sort of a directive change on the overseas sort of opinions about China.
Yeah.
And because
Yeah.
what you mentioned was interesting. Before, they were doing like these James Bond type of weird videos. Like the jokes didn't even like feel like they made
Yeah,
sense
they
to
were
the
really.
person who wrote it. Like that kind of stuff, right? It is
You know, a
really
good example
blunt.
of this.
Yeah.
Sorry. One good example of this, like just to show like how like sort of like stilted this is, right? Like I remember when it came to Xinjiang and like the Uyghur issue, they had this big campaign where like their slogan was Xinjiang is a beautiful place. And it
Yeah.
just sounds like so like communist North Korea style. Like they were
Yeah.
going around like paying people to go, Xinjiang is a beautiful place. And it's like it's not effective because like you see that from a Western perspective, and you're like, why are you telling me that like this random location is so beautiful,
I
right?
know.
Compare that to like the I Show Speed, which was way more subtle. Like he was just
Yeah.
walking through the town. But yeah, sorry, you go on. I'm sorry
No,
I interrupted.
no. I'm just saying, like what you mentioned is like they changed the strategy with the iShow Speed Stream. They gave the power to those like influencer agencies that
Yeah,
facilitate the leg of the tour, right? Like So where did Speed go? First, he went to Shanghai. He met with Jackson Wang, this like
yeah,
Chinese celebrity, right? And then next stop, he's in Beijing. He met with Tom, what's his name, Miles Moretti, the guy wearing the flowery suit. And it's like,
yes,
oh wow, so convenient. He got to meet some of the biggest like foreign voices that's projecting China's image. And then when he
yeah,
was in, he like had a sudden encounter with some singer who sang a song called Super Idol, but later people found it was pre-recorded like the video before. So their
yeah,
first so-called encounter was really not a first encounter. So it's like they made these like really good choreographed,
yeah,
organic looking parts of the live
yeah,
stream that was super effective. I think they gave, or at least for this part, they gave the power back to those local influencer agencies, which
yeah,
obviously like such a different thing. And so to an average American kid or like somebody in Australia, when you see that and you like Speed, you don't care if this is propaganda. You think that this is just Speed having such a good, like wonderful interaction with the Chinese fans, which is like any deeper thought into this. Chinese fans, how are they watching iShow Speed, right? They're using
yeah,
VPNs. VPNs
yeah,
will get you fined in China if you watch YouTube or Twitch or anything like that.
yeah, yeah.
So, but
Like
I think,
these platforms are literally banned. They're
yeah,
literally
well,
banned.
I think they're just doing this sort of how would you even call it, like those like the people who aren't willing to go deeper into looking at the investigate what's behind this type of stuff.
Yeah,
I think they're just trying to influence those people, and that's the hard part, right? People are like, oh, you lost your 1.6 billion funding thing for anti-China propaganda. I'm like, I've never been paid by the US government. Like I would
yeah,
I would love to be paid by the CIA or something,
yeah.
100,000 a
I
year
fully
to
agree.
do this. Like I would love to, but they're not paying me. But it's like they just think
Yeah,
everything is done with money because they're actually the ones who use money to pay for
yeah,
the influencers.
absolutely.
But it's hard though, and I think that's why you need more people to really just kind of go at different angles to expose that.
Yeah, no, that's such a funny point, right? Like for years, I had people going like, "Oh, Drew's paid by the CIA, Drew's paid by the Mossad or whatever," and like, dude, I'm literally just like one guy. Like, and
Yeah,
and the funny thing is like there actually isn't like a funding ecosystem or whatever. Like if you look at the people who are trying to push back against like the anti-CCP, on the anti-CCP front, we have nothing compared to like the massive industrial scale propaganda machinery
yeah,
that exists in China. And China spends like almost more money on its internal security than it does on actual defense. Like they have tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to just pump into this stuff.
yeah.
So yeah, like we were really up against it. It's so interesting. You're right. Like I think this is like the first time in a long time I've seen like they actually kind of had a smart propaganda campaign. And it's probably
Mm.
because they sort of like gave a little bit more power to the local influencers and stuff. And yeah, dude, it was so choreographed. Like they had him going on like one of those like sort of the robo taxis, all those
Yeah,
sort of things. Like he was able. They put him in all these sort of cyberpunk locations with all. It's funny because like I do love the sort of cyberpunk aesthetic. And
mhm.
like, I see the photos and like it is cool to have like, neon lights and skyscrapers and stuff like that. But it is funny that like their whole narrative is like, oh, city with neon lights, therefore China is 1,000 years ahead
Yeah,
of the West.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, let's go into that a bit, right? Because this is such a good question. It's such a tough question. To what extent are they, you know, advancing in a range of, very important technological fields? So
Mhm.
from my perspective, I've read that, in AI, in EVs, they are right at the cutting edge.
Mm.
That said, at the same time, there is this concerted effort online, obviously, to always try and present China as like, this extremely technologically advanced civilization that's so far ahead of the West. I mean, look, the high-speed rail network is like a fascinating thing. I wish we had high-speed rail in America and West, etc. At the same time, there's still so much poverty in China. There's still more than hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who live on, what would be starvation wages in the West.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's get into this. Like where are they actually at the cutting edge of technology? Where are they actually challenging the West? To what extent is this stuff really hyped up? This is an interesting question.
So it's a question. It's going to get a little bit long, but I'll try to keep it concise. Basically,
it's an important topic. So go into it. Yeah.
So first of all, Chinese people are smart and they have the intelligence, and they have the courage even, I think, to innovate. Because here's the problem with the Chinese ecosystem. When somebody gets something that's kind of innovative done, right? Instead of letting them kind of do their thing, the government just says, hey, let me take over the control of your company because you're valuable and we're going to make you big, right? So they get really big, like, the case with smartphones, Huawei is the one. The case with cars, BYD is the one, right? But then once that one man, one person in power who rules everything type of system comes to your company, you can't innovate anymore. So for me, my perspective is that if you let the Chinese people actually innovate, they might catch up, in 10, 20 years. But because of the system that's been kind of put over that, to be honest, I haven't seen anything that China has innovated that the West didn't already have. What they've done is they've taken that, let's say, DeepSeek,
already
right?
existing technology,
They built up on top of it. They make it cooler or they make it look prettier. Like the Xiaomi SU7, it looks like a Porsche, but it's got all these like auto driving functions, all these like cool functions. Like they try to make it seem like it's an innovation, but it's more of so rather than a vertical innovation, they're like doing horizontal innovation, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so at the end of the day, what I think the issue here is not the people can't innovate. It's not that people don't have this idea, right? But it's because I think that the system doesn't allow them to actually innovate. So basically, I mean, if you take a look what some of their most touted sort of stuff that they really want to like make it seem like China's great at. One is obviously the whole this AI chatbot thing. And the second one is the EV, like you mentioned. Maybe even phones, right? Like that Huawei triple fold. That it looks amazing.
They're promoting it a lot lately. I think they had high speed. I think they had speed with the triple phone. Yeah.
It's that they make it like with the propaganda effort. They package it really well. And so, but if to any sort of an expert in that field, you realize that it's not true innovation. So what does that mean in terms of like, say, 10 years down the line, right? If China can't change their ways of allowing innovation to flow, instead they're still doing things like counterfeiting, stealing IPs, essentially copying other designs, then they will never surpass or the United States or other countries because they can never truly innovate. And that's, I think, the core issue. It's that China wants to innovate, but they can't, but they still want to pretend like they did innovate. So that creates obviously the issue, which I think personally is pretty convenient for me, because in almost every industry, you can find that, oh, wow, look, this thing they built, it's great, but it's not new. It's not like there was the recent propaganda with those like, what do they say, Gucci, Prada, and Hermes, they're made in China, right? Like that stuff. It's like, it's true, because the reality is that you can get the same quality leather, the same hardware, or the same material to make that, say, Birkin bag, but why can't Chinese brands just innovate something of the same level as Hermes? Why do they have to say that come buy this, copycat or replica version of Hermes, right? Like, because so it just feels like they spent all their IQs and intelligence in the wrong place. They spent it all on trying to copy others rather than innovating. And I think that's fundamentally because of the government. And because, I mean, if we really talk about the Chinese history, China has done a lot of great inventions, like the compass, paper printing, like all these things, right? So those, like, to say that Chinese people can't innovate is just not true. But to say that the Chinese government in its current environment doesn't allow innovation, I think is definitely how I see things go. So yeah, like no matter what, I personally think no matter what, if this 50 years or 100 years, if they can't change the way they do things, they simply won't be able to innovate. And I think that's always going to be what's causing them to lag behind at the end of the day.
Interesting. Like, I listened to a podcast yesterday. I mean, are you familiar with like sort of like Thomas Friedman and Ezra Klein?
Yeah.
Okay. So like they had a podcast yesterday on Ezra Klein's show with the New York Times, and Thomas Friedman is, I mean, you could probably say he's a China booster. He's like a public intellectual, and he's pretty pro engagement. He's pro like. Anyway, like he recently went on a trip to China, and like I got some quotes here because I actually wanted to like run them past you because I felt the way he was talking about it was he was saying there are actually fields where they're like genuinely ahead of us, and we would need to do technology transfer to level the playing field, which is like on the surface level, that's a pretty alarming thing. He was saying it in the sense of like if we don't acknowledge this reality that they actually are pulling ahead in some technological fields, then that might mean we lose this coming, confrontation, this coming hegemonic confrontation. So I've got these quotes here. He goes, when you talk to American or European businesses who operate in China, they'll say, we first came here for the market, and now we come here to be close to the innovation, and we cannot be in touch with the cutting edge of our field in autos unless we're here. China realized it could not compete with America on combustion vehicles, so it leapfrogged them with electric vehicles, now autonomous driving cars. It moved smartphone companies into becoming car companies. He was talking about, the last time he went to China before COVID, Xiaomi was a phone company, Huawei was a phone company. Now they're doing cars. They're making these really advanced models. He was saying that he mentioned, like, for example, the former head of the European Union Chamber of Commerce, and he calls it the China Fitness Club. And he basically says, this is his legit quote. He says, unless you're in the gym with them, you're going to get run over. And like, like the way he portrays that's a very, that's pretty alarming to me. And it's different to, I guess, how the narrative over the past couple of years has certainly been that China is in decline. And I was certainly, after COVID, they've definitely got some really long-term structural challenges. Like, for example, the birth rate demographics are just terrible in China. They have this massive mountain of debt. As you point to things like, for example, the tofu dreg construction. There is a lot of fraud in this economy, etc. But the way that he was talking about it was actually pretty scary to me. He was saying, and so he was talking about the fitness gym analogy, and he goes, it works like this: a new industry comes along, call it solar panels. Every major city in China decides they need a solar panel factory. The local government subsidizes it. Then you have 75 solar panel companies. They compete like crazy against each other in the fitness gym. 5 of them survive. Those 5 are so fit that they can now go global at a price and level of innovation that is very hard for any foreign competitor to deal with, which is why China now controls the global solar panel market. He basically says, like, the supply chains are so advanced, the level of innovation, if we don't recognize that in the West, we're going to get steamrolled. I'm interested in your thinking here. I think he's too much of a China booster, but it is alarming. To me, it feels like maybe we need to take some of this technological innovation, for example, in AI and vehicles, etc. Like, you're right that, like, these are not technologies they invented, but potentially they bring it to directions that are taking it to a new level of advance that maybe if we don't realize that in the West, it will be really bad for us long term. I'm interested in your thoughts.
I actually agree with him in the sense that what I just said about innovation, I'm talking about. So here's the thing, right? Let's take 5G, for example, which is a very prominent sort of technological gap that we felt. It was that, China felt like they dominated 5G, right? I think they might have even dominated 4G. But I think the issue is that what they do is, so let's say, I'll use the example of Tesla, right? Say Tesla first popularized this idea that EV cars can do self-driving, and you can go pretty well with a electric car. But then look at BYD. What they did was they essentially took what Tesla sort of introduced, and then they put out mass production, state subsidy, some horizontal level advancement in which they kind of completed that. sort of EV space, right? Same thing with solar panels. Same thing with uh, certain levels of technology. But here's my issue: is I think this is where China stops.
Yeah.
So they can make something look very advanced at its current innovation level, but I don't think China is going to lead in certain areas where it doesn't already exist. So that's why. So people think that what China's doing, like in that podcast, what they say, I think it's very much true. If you go to China right now, it might shock you in the sense that they, like, even the bullet train technology, right? They
Yeah.
stole it from Germany and Japan, but they perfected it.
Yeah.
So that's why I say that the innovation part that's not true innovation. So I just feel like if it comes down to this current versus current, I think China has a big edge because, like you mentioned, what they do is when they mandated that everybody would do semiconductors, they had this huge semiconductor fund. Literally,
Yeah.
these meat production companies switched to doing semiconductors, right?
Yeah.
Those people, they're not going to make money doing this, but they're going to make
Yeah.
some money from the program. So
Yeah.
that's the issue. Same thing with those. I think there's like 40 different EV companies. One
There
would
was
literally,
that,
one would reveal a product in September and then 3 months later go bankrupt because those
yeah,
people,
true.
like,
Good
they're
point.
not really in it for the thing, right? But you do mention something that is important, which is the state champions that
Yeah.
do survive these type of things. They're really big. But I
Yeah.
think and then again, my argument where I start to disagree is that I think at the end of the day, the system will cap itself. The system will handicap the companies. And I think that future innovations in even higher fields of technology, I don't think that they're able to surpass the West because of this. They're ultimately hindered by the system. So that's where I sort of disagree with what he said.
That's interesting. Like the narrative certainly is like this is the narrative they push a lot, and it is very popular on social media and TikTok and stuff. The idea that like China is actually the future. China is already ahead of us. Like what is the grain of truth that exists to make that such a popular narrative? Do you think there are areas where they have potentially advanced or where they are just really, really strong and we need to catch up? Like where do you think the current competition sits?
Yeah. So I think it's actually a very simple answer. It comes down to what is the fundamental value of the system. So
Yeah.
we can, as obviously the world advances, as technology goes to a certain part, maybe even automated robots in our households, there
Yeah.
still is going to be something that I think fundamentally that differs us to that of China. It
Yeah.
is the ideology. Now, the reason why I say this is because China without the CCP, I believe, is going to flourish. I personally even
Yeah.
think
I
it,
agree
it
with you.
might be it might be a number one economy one day. But
Yeah.
the issue is, look at what Xi Jinping did for the past decade. He
Yeah.
took China's economy from a really good spot to a terrible spot. So, and then there's no course correction, right? Today, there's still issues. So I think no matter what happens, there's always fundamentally going to be a ideological hindrance to the communist system that I don't think is just going to allow it to reach its maximum potential. Now, the thing people always say China is the future, China is the future. I don't know if China is the future means convenience or actually the future, because the thing is, I just saw a video recently. I think it's a perfect illustration of this, to my point of ideology. So this foreigner who speaks fluent Mandarin, he was like, "Oh, China has freedom. What freedom?" Well, he then shows him going to the subway, and
Gosh.
China's subways apparently have business class seats. He then showed that you can order Starbucks in a Chinese EV, or you can get your drone delivery from like a fast food chain. These are convenience, right?
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
an average Joe, that might seem like this is advancement, this is the future. But we've seen enough sci-fi movies to understand that, like, the dystopian future is precisely this type of stuff, where they use convenience, where they use this ease of access to say that, hey, so the people forget what you need to do on a personal level. Let us handle all of that. All you need to do is feel like you're being taken care of. Uh, is that really freedom? That's not really freedom. That's convenience,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
that's why I feel like where it's getting a lot of people where they see that China, well, look, in China, you can like travel at a speed of 400 kilometers an hour in a bullet train, or you can, go to places and you still have Wi-Fi underground in the tunnels. But does that really matter at the end of the day if you can't talk freely about what you want to say, if you can't,
Yeah.
browse the internet as freely as you want to, or even choose who your leaders are? Those are
Yeah.
fundamental things that I think even if you can fly a drone to Mars, wouldn't solve, because I think those are things that you lack. And I mean, if contemporary history has shown us, the last time there was this difference in ideology and there was
Yeah.
a tech competition, we obviously know who the winner was.
Yeah.
The Soviet Union lost in the process. So I think ultimately, when things are done, when you come to the ring, it's about ideology, it's about system, and I just simply don't see how the Chinese current system is superior.
Well, this is the funny thing, right? Like, yeah, people make this big show and dance of like, oh wow, they've got like, the flying drones, they've got robo taxis and stuff like that. But you can't even search Xi Jinping's name on the internet, man.
Exactly.
You literally can't even search the characters. Like, it just nothing comes up.
Yep.
You can't, like, that's the level of censorship. I think that's the funny thing, right? Like, people don't even realize how intense the censorship is. Like, I see people go. I saw this on Twitter the other day. Someone was like, oh wow, so you can't talk about Tiananmen. Like, well, why are you so obsessed with Tiananmen? There are things in the West that you can't talk about, blah blah. And then they like mention like, I don't know, like, oh, you might get someone might call you racist if you say something that's politically incorrect, blah blah blah. But it's like, dude, that's different to, you can't even search the leader of your country's name on the internet. Like, that's another level, right? So and here's another thing that I wanted to talk about, right? Like, especially with how insane Russia has been the past few years. Like Russia literally has the state television.
Yeah.
They'll have state television where they're literally just openly talking about like nuking London, nuking Paris. Like the rhetoric that comes out of Russia is just like so unhinged and so crazy that, and like the way they've acted as well. Like, people will often try to say, oh well, like, compared to Russia, China is like a stabilizing power. Like, China is such a more, like, China is a stable force in the world compared to, like, say, Russia, or compared to, say, Trump now, etc. Like, they don't realize though, like the memories are so short, because just a couple of years ago, man, like China put $150 billion in sanctions on Australian trade
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't like one of the things that our government said. Like,
Yep.
like they put $150 billion in sanctions on us, and then now there are all these people going like, you just can't trust America. You have to, now we all look to China as like, the power we can trust.
Mm-hmm.
But they put $150 billion in sanctions on Australia because the Australian government said that there should be an independent investigation into COVID. Like, they arguably brought on the pandemic because in the early days of the pandemic, like, they would try to cover everything up. And look, it's increasingly likely that it was like a lab leak from Wuhan. This is not a stable power. This is not a stable power at all. They're backing Russia as well. They're backing Iran. And also, like, for all the advancement, for all the drones, all this stuff, like, you don't see on the iShow speed that they have kindergarteners learning Xi Jinping thought in Chinese schools, right? Like, they've actually mandated that for Chinese kids. Like, that's so regressive. That's like going back decades in the past, like a cult of leadership
Yeah.
like that. You just look at the iShow speed, you see the iShow speed stream, and you're like, oh wow, look at the technology, they're so advanced. But then at the same time, you've got 6, 7 year olds forced to study the leader's cult in school. Like, this is what people don't see. This idea that China is now like a stabilizing force in the world, that you can look to China for dependency when Trump does crazy stuff and when Russia's going crazy. Let's talk about that, because I don't think China is a stabilizing force at all. You probably, of course, you'd agree, but like, here's another good example, right? Like, there's literally laws in, whenever people try and bring up that, like, China is such a rational power, they're just like, this was another thing that Thomas Friedman had in his podcast. He was talking about like the Mandarin system, and like how, it's a very meritocratic system. The deep state there, this is his quote, right? He goes, like, he goes, yes, you can't do an op-ed piece condemning Xi Jinping. That'll be the last op-ed piece you write. But at the same time, China has a Mandarin tradition going back a long way. People who have to work in the government have to take a test. It's a very meritocratic test. And the product is, on a whole, as a generalization, the deep state there is actually really good, really quite responsible when it comes to backing innovation. It can arrest you when you get out of line, but it's actually really meritocratic, good government, very rational. And then I'm like, but dude, do you realize, like, there's literally laws passed by the Chinese Communist Party trying to restrict like Tibetan lamas from reincarnating. They've got literally laws that will ban the Dalai Lama from reincarnating without the permission of the Chinese Communist Party, which is insane. They've literally got laws trying to extend into the supernatural realm. Like, this is where the Chinese government is. And then these people tell us, oh, they've got the Mandarin system. It's such a, even if you don't like the Chinese Communist Party, it's such a technocratic, smart government. Let's go into this topic of, like, the so-called technocracy argument, the idea that they've got such a really, really effective state, etc.
I think so. It's very attractive to a certain set of Westerners because, so I think obviously I don't want to say religion is a factor, but the Chinese government is an atheist government. It doesn't have any ties to any religion, so it's very easy for them to go after any religious groups. And so I think for a subset of Western people too, I feel like this idea that science is tied to the Chinese government, and so therefore we should embrace that because of science. But I feel like I'm not saying that you can't be atheist, but I'm saying that a part of this, because they glorify this idea that,
like, hyper materialistic,
hyper materialistic, that China can foster this type of environment, then obviously, they're very in favor of that. I think there's also the appeal of socialism too, especially to the Western, like
planning,
young people, right? This idea that we can all be equal, we can all get distributed the same thing, we can all get this to reach the communist utopia, right? I personally find that it's fundamentally impossible to achieve, and it's never been done in China nor any other country that has tried this stuff. Like, look at North Korea, they plan everything, everybody's poor. In China, when Mao did this everybody was, well, first they were, before they were starving, they were eating massive amount of food, and then suddenly they realized they overate, then became the famine, or that everybody was burning their pots and pans because they no longer need to cook at home.
The insane stuff,
right? So it's like it's
sparrows.
almost like, exactly. So I think at the end of the day, you can't stop people from believing a technocratic state is something that if they want to embrace it, well, maybe they should go. But I also feel like this is where the power of the Chinese people really come in. It's because I think this is what we lack. We lack stories from people in China who have really experienced what it's like to live in that environment, to tell people about it. But also at the same time, I also feel like that no matter what China does, no matter what they say, fundamentally, you just have to observe some of the fine details. Like, you mentioned this idea about meritocracy, right? In the Mandarin system. Yes, Chinese high school graduation is all about the college entrance exam called Gaokao, right? The Gaokao, sends millions of kids into college, and then after 4 years of college, well, at least right now, actually, even when I was like 5, I've heard like neighbors and parents in China talking about how their kids can't find jobs after college. So it's not just a recent issue, but every year there's like 1.2 million graduates from college who are sitting at home in China right now and can't find a job. Sure, China has a huge focus on scores and testing, but what they're doing is they're making a lot of test score machines, and they're making a lot of exam machines rather than real learners, right? And real innovators. And this is different. That's, again, I feel like where China lacks a lot is most of the kids who are learning in China are not innovators, they're followers. And China, throughout the school, you're right, they teach this Xi thought, they teach the whole communist thing in the system. So kids grow up learning not to say certain things, not to know certain things. But it has not stopped people from, and I think this is where the hopeful part is, the young people, right? We saw this with the white paper protest in China. The young people today aren't so prone to the Chinese young people I'm talking about aren't so prone to the state propaganda, and they have independent thinking. So I think if any change were to come to China, it would be from the younger generation. So I think right now the issue is that Western, especially I think a lot of Americans, probably some in Australia too, still haven't let go of their view of China from, I'd say, like 2-3 decades ago. Except they've just carried it over into this new mindset that China is in the future now. I think I think that is, at least in my view, it's becoming a smaller and smaller influence. It still exists to some people, but I just feel like that kind of thinking, it doesn't validate with the truth on the ground in China, and it goes back to the system again, right? Like when one person is in control of everything, it doesn't go well. Like, yeah, you can say that Trump is a dictator. You can say that, the American system is failing, right? It's choosing a dictator or whatever. But fundamentally, you can say this stuff and you
Yeah, you
won't end
can
up
say
in,
it.
right? You won't end
Yeah,
up in jail for saying this stuff. You can criticize it. But if you can't even do that in China, where's the course correction on that? And when a system doesn't have
yeah,
course correction, it means that it's going down a one path. It's on a railroad that does not have a brake attached to it. And that's where you see China's headed. So it's very hard for me to agree with that type of thinking, especially when it comes to like tech and all that.
yeah,
So because I don't think tech is everything, right? I think there's such more important things to the world today than technology. And I think if you let technology be the governing sort of deciding factor, I don't think that's right. And that's where I draw the line. I think it's
yeah. I agree with you there.
right. Like, so in China, the thing is, oh, cool. You can have like facial ID systems to check out your grocery, or you can order things online and get it delivered to you in 3 hours. But I think if you ask a Chinese person, would they rather have that convenience versus being able to, freely practice their religion or say whatever they want without the fear of being taken to the police station? I think a lot of people would probably choose to have that. And when people can't even enjoy the fundamental freedoms, I don't think, I think they're being numb in the sense that this is what they can only have. So why not just
Mm,
enjoy it instead? Because we know we don't have the other stuff available to us.
yeah, yeah. I guess this comes into the question of legitimacy. To
Yeah.
what extent do you think Xi Jinping has popularity in China? And we recently have seen these like really high profile purges. So, for
Mhm.
example, there was the number two officer in the People's Liberation Army,
Yes.
member of the Chinese Communist Party Politburo, very, very senior figure. I think his name's General He Weidong.
Yes.
And he's been purged now, he's been removed. Financial Times says that this was a purge initiated by Xi Jinping,
Yeah.
and people are wondering, does this mean that he's maybe purging officers in the PLA who are saying we're not ready to go to Taiwan? Could it mean that he wants to accelerate the timeline? You have an interesting take where you think Xi's not actually in control here. It shows that he's losing control of the military. So please get into this, because this is such an interesting question. This is one of the major reasons I wanted to talk to you. Like this recent really interesting stuff we see with the top level purges. It's so hard to see from the outside what's
Mhm.
happening. And I think a lot of people think that it's Xi purging these officials. You have this interesting alternative kind of view on that.
Yeah.
Can you please get into that? Yeah.
So, like everybody else, before last summer, I was in the camp that she is in total control, especially after what we
Mm.
saw with the 2022 20th Party Congress, right? We saw him
Yeah.
removing former leader Hu Jintao from the closing ceremony, and it was
That was
very
scary.
public. So since then, obviously, we thought that she was in control. But I think, so last summer in July of 2024, there was a rumor where she allegedly suffered a stroke. And you can find this photo when he went to go visit Vietnam. I think a few months later, there was there's a like a 90-degree sort of hairline cut on the right side of his the back of the neck. So I went around and I asked some medical friends, and there is a possible surgery for stroke, which is it's a minimal invasive one, but it does get into from the back of the neck there. So which obviously I'm not going to say that this is all direct, like 100% concrete evidence that something happened, but I think, or at least the information that I was hearing from sources in China was that during this time there was a takeover. Now, so to remind everybody, right, a little bit of the history lesson. It's not the first time where China's general secretary or the Chinese leader is a puppet or is a figurehead. Deng Xiaoping, for example, he was not a general secretary or the chairman, but he was part of this elder committee type of thing that
Mm,
was still above the general secretary. So he basically was the actual person who had all the say. So what happened, in my opinion, was that similar things had happened where the elders of the
That's how they purged Zhao Ziyang, right? I've got his biography right behind me. Yeah.
yeah, that's exactly. He was the general secretary. So that's where you mentioned this military thing, which is very important. So Xi Jinping, his second in command, the second vice chair of the Central Military Commission, He Weidong, is the guy who was directly responsible for the Taiwan invasion. Months before this happened, another important figure, Mao Hua, who's essentially part of the political commissary, like he's basically in control of the political ideology of the military. He was also purged. So my thinking is this with the military. If Xi Jinping was truly in control and he really wanted to get rid of people who are like, hey, we're not ready to invade Taiwan, right? Going with that line of thinking, you can't just get rid of the people that at least you put into place yourself, because that only amplifies the opposition's power in the military. Because Xi Jinping, he didn't, when he came into power, he never had the control of the military like previous leaders had. So his entire first 10 years was about purging, because the whole anti-corruption movement in his time was basically about replacing those people who are not his with his people, right? So throughout this entirety, the struggle against the military was always to find his own people. So in this critical time that you're getting closer to this Taiwan invasion timeline, you're saying that we're going to take away my most, trusted people in the military that I put into place. I'm going to get rid of them so that the opposition's their power is growing. That doesn't make sense to me. And so for me, I view this, it was a decision not made by Xi Jinping. And there's another piece of important information, which again, you can find in a video on X and other platform. So in Zhang Youxia, who is basically the first vice chair, or the guy a little bit higher than the guy who got purged, in 2024, during the closing ceremony of the two sessions, when Xi Jinping walked by, he eagerly turned around and waited to say bye to Xi Jinping, like very respectfully. And then this year, 2025, the same exact event, same closing ceremony, when Xi walked by, he didn't even bother turning around to look at him. This is in that politics sort of sphere, this is impossible. You cannot be disrespectful to the leader like that. So to go along with that rumor, essentially what I was told was that Zhang Youxia is now in control of the military in taking direct order from the elders. So when a CCP leader loses the chairman position of the Central Military Commission, he effectively becomes the figurehead, in the sense that he no longer has real says in the party. Now, obviously, Xi Jinping right now still is the general secretary, right? He's still the chairman Xi that everybody sees. But some other signs which I thought was very interesting was when he went to Vietnam recently, his wife wasn't accompanying him. And it's strange to me, because usually these type of events, like usually the state visits, the wife, the first lady of China would be there. She wasn't. There was also some other stuff, like, for example, during that same period of time where she allegedly suffered a stroke, there was a article published by the Chinese state media called Xi Jinping the Reformer, right? It was praising how Xi Jinping was enacting reform and rebuild of China. And then it was taken down like hours after it was published, which is extremely strange. Then months after, the PLA Daily, the newspaper for the military of China, came out to bash and criticize Xi Jinping's ideologies and this idea of a personal cult of personality, and called for collective leadership. So there are all these like little signs and sort of circumstantial evidence to me that felt like it was very, very strange to happen. But this stuff, like, if you don't read into it, you might just think that, oh yeah, well, it's probably just Xi Jinping purging his own people. So that's why I formulate my opinion based on that, to say that I think there's troubles in the deep troubles within the CCP.
Gee, that's so interesting. It's hard, right? Because it's so inscrutable. Like, you've got to be like reading the tea leaves so closely. And I wish we could know for sure what's happening inside there. But I mean, it is fascinating. I mean, it's interesting because I think your theory would probably explain why there seems to have been some big policy changes. Like it's interesting because we know like Xi basically purged Jack Ma, But then recently we have him meeting with Jack Ma again,
Yeah.
delivering like a speech that sounds like very conciliatory to the sort of like tech leaders and the business leaders and stuff like that, which seems to be like a 180-degree policy turn. And I mean, you could read that as like Xi is, being flexible because the economy was going bad and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But a lot of the time, like it's hard. We never really saw Xi exhibit much flexibility, especially with COVID, right?
Yeah.
Like this was the most inflexible man in history. So, I mean, would you say if would that be potentially another indicator that he's losing power? Things like, the meeting with the business leaders, Jack Ma coming back, like people like that who were really high profile and purged.
So that's very interesting because that reminded me. So Nikkei Asia had a reporter. I can't remember his name, but he basically has this special column called China Up Front or China Up Close. He had written all these like opinion pieces about what happened years prior. So I think this was 2023. Basically, there was this scenario where he painted that she somehow had like locked up a bunch of these like CCP elders almost in like their retirement home with close
Oh
watch.
yes,
Yeah, and then he basically was saying how she kind of like disrespected them and basically just kind of like house arrested them in a sense to prevent
I
them
remember
from
this.
gathering and conspiring them, right? But then what was interesting last year was after this whole summer thing happened, she invited for the 75th year anniversary celebration gala, I believe it was. He invited, so they had these like huge round tables. Who sat next to Xi it was Xi in the middle. To the right was Wen Jiabao, the former premier, during like 2003 to 2000 something. It was Hu
Yeah,
Jintao and Wen Jiabao, and then to the left was Li Ruihuan, who was also sort of a. I think those, like, if I had anybody that I respect in the CCP, it would be these two people because Wen was very pro reform and economy. He was also
yeah,
a protege of Zhao Ziyang and the whole reformers, right?
yeah,
Part of the party. And then Li Ruihuan was also very pretty respectful in that sense. And a lot of people at the time were thinking, oh, it's just Xi Jinping showing that he cares about the elders, that he
yeah,
cares to show off that, he still respects them. Because in the CCP, respect and seniority is everything, right? But
yeah,
then now looking at it, I'm just like wondering, why would you bring out these two people who are on the complete opposite side of economy, policies, and everything to that? I
yeah.
think it's actually because he was forced to by these people to come out to show that, hey, actually, you're not that in control. You don't have much say anymore. So to answer your part about the Jack Ma situation, I actually thought it was very interesting because recently there was another sort of case like this. And again, you can find this on the CCTV report videos footage as well. They had this meeting about foreign affairs, but strangely, no one in the Politburo, like everybody was present there, was taking notes because usually you see the CCP officials, they're like busy
Yeah,
writing down notes
yeah,
and
yeah,
stuff. But this one, they all just like deadpan looked at the front and nobody was taking notes, which is very
yeah,
strange. So it was like there's something absolutely weird going on in the party, and nobody knows it except for these people, and they're just not telling us, right? And then what's even more strange is that usually, for example, the Wall Street Journal reporter Wei Lingling, or maybe even the guys at New York Times, they would have occasionally, I would say they'd be given certain information from within the party to tell the world, but it's so tight shut on this that I don't think, at least in my memory, I don't recall them talking about this purge yet, which I just find it quite strange because with the foreign minister Qin Gang and with what's his name, the defense ministers,
yeah.
uh, the media were more like attentive in terms of covering that, whereas this
Yeah,
case
they
with
were
Huawei,
really big stories.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's very strange that they're less attentive to cover it. So again, these are just my speculations, but it's a pretty
yeah,
educated guess for me. But obviously, at the end of the day, time will tell where things go. I don't think
yeah,
it's going to be too long before we know, because there's the CCP's fourth plenum for the 20th Party Congress. It was supposed to happen back in January this year, but
yeah,
it's, I would say, taking place this summer. If something happens or something major were to take place, it would be at that meeting. So I think that's the next sort of major plot point we're looking
yeah.
towards.
It's so hard because it's like full blown Kremlinology vibes, like just like reading like the slightest signals. But like, I mean, this theory would explain why there seems to be like some kind of change in policy and stuff like that. It's really interesting. Would you what would be the meaning of this, right? Like, if it is true that Xi has lost power within the party, does that mean like, it puts the timeline for a potential invasion of Taiwan back quite a bit? Like what would be the consequences if Xi is losing power inside the party in terms of like a power struggle?
Yeah, so a great question. Number one is the party is never gonna say, hey, let's abandon our system and let's just turn into a democracy. They're never going to do that. It's all about preserving the party. So even those powers that are struggling for who to replace Xi after this, they would still be saying, hey, let's work as a party to preserve our identity. Second, with the Taiwan invasion, I think it's still going to happen in terms of the preparation, because here's the thing, right? Like, me saying that Xi losing power, it doesn't necessarily mean that the CCP lost its ambition to conquer Taiwan, right? Those are two different things. So even if Xi Jinping says, hey, or whoever says, you're no longer in control, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Taiwan invasion is not on the minds of the CCP. It's still there. It was something that started in the Mao era. It's just during the whole reform and opening up, because they didn't want the West to know that they were going to be hostile towards Taiwan, they kind of went a little bit silent on that part. But with Xi, obviously, he thought that China is booming and he can just be more flexy with his muscles, right? But then we might go back to that period of sort of hide and bide, right? Hide your intentions and bide your time. It's not a good thing. And here's another thing, right? Here's another thing. Let's just say that they happen to find a replacement for Xi. Who would know if that person will be worse or better than Xi as a leader, right? They could be somebody who's even more aggressively, totalitarian, or they could be somebody who's saying, hey, maybe like a Gorbachev, right? Like maybe a little bit more relaxed. You never know. So it's not a good thing to say that, oh yeah, Xi is gone, that means happy ending for everybody. No, it doesn't. It just means that temporarily there is a big storm inside the CCP. And we should maximize our effort, obviously, to push for democracy in China. But I don't think we should be very wishful thinking in the sense that this is somehow going to change a lot of things immediately, at least.
Yeah, I remember like when Xi first came to power, and even when Kim Jong-un first came to power, like there were a lot of people like wish casting, hoping like, wow, what if these guys are reformers? And like, of course, it's like the absolute opposite. That's the funny thing, right? Like Xi has actually been like really incompetent at times, because by abandoning hide your strength, bide your time, the Deng Xiaoping philosophy, he actually he did so much to basically start building up a big coalition in Asia against him. Japan coming together, South Korea, Taiwan, the rise of the Quad, etc. That's the thing. Like I think he's actually the one who does so much damage to the party. So if they were to go back to like I remember there's a guy, Noah Smith, that I like. He's like a liberal blogger, and he writes that like Comrade G is like a CIA agent because like he's helping us, sort of thing. The funny thing is though, like if they go back to that sort of like smart hide your strength, bide your time fantasy, that means like all the kind of elites in the West who over the past 5-10 years have had to confront reality. Yes, China's changing. Yes, we can't go on the same way. Like they will just be racing to go back to how things were.
Exactly. And I think that's the issue, right? Now, here's the criticism for both the parties in the United States. It wasn't just one party that was like pro-China. It was like both parties were, China is the future, right? We got to work with them. So this thinking, we can't go back to that, right? Trump in 2016 changed the conversation about China. Biden continued it. And I think the world needs to continue that no matter who comes in after. And I think, the best example of this of waking up would be in the Philippines, right? We all thought that maybe a Marcos Jr. maybe he would still continue that cozy up with China, but then sort of the hammer hit him and he really woke up to the threat. So I hope more countries are like that. And I think I thought it was very interesting that Australia suffered such a big impact with that like. I call it a trade invasion from China because of a single
economic
thing.
It was economic.
It's an economic warfare, right? It's like because you asked a simple question. So I just don't know like why Australia didn't continue to be more aware of the China threat after that.
I can tell you why, man.
Yeah,
And
go ahead.
this is a really big problem in Australian politics. Like, so at the last election, the government was decided by one seat in our parliamentary system. So Labor won a one-seat majority. In winning that one-seat majority, there were about 4 or 5 seats with with a very large number of Chinese Australians in these seats, particularly in like the inner cities of Melbourne and Sydney, and one in Perth as well. And these seats with a really large Chinese Australian population swung really heavily. They were Liberal seats, and they swung really heavily for Labor. And the reason why, like the Chinese government has, complete control over like WeChat and stuff like that. And they were running like disinformation campaigns. They were running this big campaign on WeChat, basically saying like the Liberals have destroyed relations with China. They're the ones who are going to bring a war. If you want to go back to normal relations, you have to have Labor, blah, blah, blah. And I think essentially what happened is like these 4 or 5 seats, they were subjected to like a pretty sophisticated information campaign, like information warfare essentially. And it like really, really huge on WeChat, really huge on Chinese social media. And unfortunately, like there was a swing in these seats that, and essentially both major parties interpreted that the message that they learned was, if you go too hard against the Chinese government, these seats with a overrepresentation of Chinese Australians, where there's WeChat access and WeChat can be weaponized by the Chinese government, these seats can now be flipped potentially against anybody who's perceived to be too anti-China. And so Peter Dutton is the leader of the Liberal Party in Australia. And it's funny because a lot of people tried to say that he's like Australia's Trump and stuff like that. And it really is it's a different analogy, right? But like he was the defense minister at the last election for the Liberals. Yeah. And in the lead up to that election, we were talking about there was a talk about Taiwan, the invasion, stuff like that. And he openly talked about there's the potential that China could invade Taiwan and lead to a war. And they then made this big campaign. Peter Dutton hates Chinese people. Peter Dutton wants to have a war with China, etc. And they've weaponized that. And now Peter Dutton, as he's running as the opposition leader at this election, he went and met with the Chinese embassy. It looks like he basically kissed the ring. He now has gone to the media and said, he literally now says, I want a good relationship with China. He calls himself pro-China now. Like it's a complete 180 different rhetoric shift, right? Both major parties have concluded, because of this election campaign in 2022, how these seats changed, because Chinese Australian voters will perceive hostility to the Chinese government as hostility to them, as like a racist campaign, as an attack on Chinese Australians, etc. Like the idea is that if you go too hard against the Chinese government, you will lose government now. It's a pretty scary thing, because it means almost like, I'm worried that it basically means Australia's foreign policy is almost kept hostage. And so now both major parties are fully saying, we want a good relationship with China, pro-China. They very rarely ever publicly criticize anything they do.
That's so interesting. I actually, this is the part where, like, for example, in the United States, if you want to become a citizen, you have to declare that, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? So it's like, it fundamentally, I think, I think one thing that
it's a really hard thing.
It's a hard thing, but one thing I'm hopeful is that if it really hits them hard, like if it really is painful, I hope that it will change no matter which party is in power.
It would be like Germany after the Ukraine invasion, but the sad thing is, like, they were in such a bad position when Russia invaded Ukraine, because they were completely dependent on Russian gas, all this stuff. And like they actually talked about it as like they were woken up from like a deep slumber. It's sad, man, because it's like that's what it took, and like they were not ready whatsoever. And that's what I'm scared for when it comes to Australia.
So I mean, I'll use the Trump example again, right?
Yeah.
Because right now what Trump is saying is that you got to choose between China or us. This is honestly probably a very big shock to, like, I think even a lot of Europeans who were kind of pro-Trump in the sense were shocked in that, why would you say this kind of thing? But I feel like, so my thing is that if you cannot, like, you don't have to immediately say, I'm going to be with the US or China. But I think you have to realize that sometimes, these kind of choices, they're tough, but it's something that I think it has to be done, because countries like Australia, right? What happens if, say, there's another global sort of like campaign around, this idea of let's say China, right? If Australia decides not to side with the United States on issues against China, I think it's going to, how do I put it this way nicely? I don't think a lot of the governments realize what they're dealing with is not a normal government in China. It's not a country.
Yeah,
I
no,
don't.
I agree with you.
Yeah, like I don't know how to put it in a way that kind of
No,
makes
no,
sense.
I
But
know what you. Here's a good example, right? And people don't realize this. When they talk about the Chinese military, it's not the Chinese military; it's the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party.
yes,
Like the People's Liberation Army is not officially the like according to the Chinese Constitution, it's not actually there to guard China. It's there to guard the Chinese Communist Party. It's like the
yes,
armed wing of a political party. That's
yes.
the thing. Yeah, yeah, and people
So
don't realize that in the West.
so that's what I'm saying is the governments, like, unless they really feel the pain, it's not going to wake them up. And same thing with a lot of Americans, I think, perhaps even Australians, that have this longing for China. I would say honestly, go live in China for a few years. Maybe that would change your perspective. It's just
It
like
would. It would.
people have to go through that type of stuff. In Chinese, they call it the iron fist of communism. It's like if you've never experienced the iron fist of communism, you never realize how bad things are.
Dude,
So
I experienced it. I experienced it when they tried to throw me out of university, and
yeah,
when I had like the kidnap plot against me, the bomb threats and stuff like that. That's how I woke up to it, right? And so when I hear like these intellectual guys that I would normally respect quite a lot, like Ezra Klein and Thomas Friedman and stuff, going on like what if like we are failing to like I just think they don't necessarily understand that it's not the Chinese government we're really dealing with. Like we're dealing with a political party
yes,
that is really like against the regime. My biggest problem though, right, with the Trump tariffs, and this is an interesting thing. I know we might have to wrap up soon, but maybe we can just briefly talk about Trump. And it's hard because I know a lot of people in the China critical, the CCP critical, like sort of dissident sphere, a lot of people really like Trump because obviously like he has a very stridently, he has a position that can be very strident, when it comes to China. My biggest problem, right, is when it is accompanied by trade wars against all the American allies as well. When it's also accompanied by like online insults against European leaders, like humiliation of European leaders, the stuff like, for example, when they had Zelensky in the White House, and that could be sort of interpreted almost as like they were doing a struggle session against him, right?
yeah,
Like my biggest problem is that they're not building up a genuine, proper kind of alliance system, because I don't think that America can do it on its own, confronting the Chinese Communist Party. I think it has to be this, like Europe has to be involved, Taiwan has to be involved, South Korea has to be involved, Japan has to be involved, Australia has to be involved. It has to be this big public thing. Like here's a good example, right? Like Vietnam, people don't realize, but Vietnam was almost on its way to being like a de facto American ally in Asia. And it's so funny because like people don't realize that, because obviously America fought in Vietnam, and it was such a and that war was horrific for Vietnam, and it was so controversial in America. People don't realize, like, because it's a bit interesting because like the Vietnamese, like obviously it's a communist party in Vietnam, but they were kind of, I mean, Ho Chi Minh and stuff, like the way a lot of people interpret it is that they were almost nationalists first and foremost. And like as nationalists, Vietnam has had this like 1,000-year history of fighting China. China has invaded Vietnam countless times. I mean, it's funny, right? Even when Vietnam invaded Cambodia to overthrow Pol Pot, China responded by invading Vietnam. And that was when they both had communist regimes, right? And so over time, Vietnam has kind of been moving a bit into the American camp, especially when it comes to South China Sea and all this stuff. And then at the same time, like Trump comes in and he puts like just 100% tariffs on Vietnam. And then what happened was that Vietnam then had to invite Xi Jinping in, and like, they're now looking at reapproachment with China. This is my big worry with Trump. This is my big problem. There's a lot of chaos, and that's where like a lot of people have drawn the sort of like Cultural Revolution analogy with Trump. And like I made a video kind of, and I was kind of joking a bit, but there are funny commonalities with like when it came to tariffs, like you had some of his biggest supporters going like, we must endure no matter what, even if we go poorer. Like I saw stuff online, right? Like there were some of the biggest MAGA guys online were saying stuff like, like some of these guys were literally going like, it doesn't matter if we go poor, it doesn't matter if we lose money, like we have to do this. And it sounded almost Maoist, right? So I made a video like, and I was half joking, like the parallels with Maoism. But my biggest problem is like the chaos, the uncertainty, the attacks on the allies and stuff like that. I really worry like that is not going to leave us in a good place when it comes to like if China invades Taiwan. Like, how will we mobilize a big international coalition against that if at the same time, the Trump administration has been insulting allies and stuff like that? And I know it's hard because probably a lot of your audience like Trump. A lot of people in my audience like Trump because, like as someone who was very critical of the Chinese government, a lot of people have come to that position. A lot of people in that camp are supportive of Trump, and they hate the fact that I can be more critical of him. But it's hard. I'm really worried about like the grand strategy here. I'm interested in your thoughts.
So I consider myself like center right, and even I was very what's it called? Very happy with how the Biden administration like did the China policy for 4 years.
I agree there.
I was actually like shocked because I was very critical in the beginning when Biden came in. I was like, oh, like given that his like son, like all those business dealings and all that, like probably not going to happen. Except things didn't actually go the way that I thought it would go, and in fact, it was very good, right? So
with the chips, like they put restrictions on some of the high end tech stuff. They kept the
like
tariffs
the Vietnam stuff you mentioned, like going, first American president to go into the hall of Ho Chi Minh, or what it's called.
Maybe I'm not sure exactly on that fact, but like they did a lot of effort to boost up.
So I was like, I'm like credit to the Biden administration for doing that. So my thing with Trump is this, right? I don't actually understand if Trump really thinks China is an enemy or not. And I say this as somebody who I'm like, the Trump administration is filled with like China hawks, right? And so I actually think, like, here's my honest opinion about Trump. I don't actually think he realizes that he's fighting against this evil empire regime, like the way that Reagan put it. I actually think he simply wants the economic stuff in his vision done because they're like, that's what China is like, cheating off the United States.
It seems a lot of the time, like it seems that he can be like, oh, we can sit down at the table and have this grand deal with Xi. Like that's where it's wrong. Like that's where it gets worried, right? Because people often say, oh, Trump's so anti-China, etc. It's like, but if you look at all the signals he's put out for many years, he's often said like, I get along so well with Xi. We can do a good deal together. We can all sit down. That's where I get really worried, right? Especially when it comes into the Russian stuff.
So I think the messaging is very, very like bad. The way that he, even like is it with Putin? Also, he's like, I'm friends with Putin. Like, I can get deals done with Putin, things like that. So I just, like I'm pretty sure Trump can get this type of stuff done without praising the others. But I don't. Maybe that's just how he feels like it's like his way of, I don't know. But anyways, but my point is this, right? I still have a lot of confidence in the overall China strategy from the U.S. government, because of like guys like Marco Rubio, big China hawk, right? Even people that they put in the Pentagon, Albert Kobe, like I personally think he'll have a great defense strategy. But in terms of actual, like, here's my thing, right? A lot of Chinese people that I've observed actually had this weird thing where they're like very anti CCP, right? But then when Trump started putting all these tariffs up, they're like, now I'm even more willing to support the Chinese government to fight against Trump for doing this. So I'm like, okay, but like, I don't think we should go that extreme.
Of course,
But then I totally get this feeling, because to the average person, like, I totally understand how this would make somebody would feel, in Europe especially, or I think even in Australia or in Southeast Asia. It's like,
even in China, right? Like my worry is that it actually might end up, helping Xi and the CCP, because like, they had their economy was declining already. They were already running into all these headwinds, and then like suddenly now Xi can go, oh, well, any economic decline, that's just from Trump's economic warfare. Like,
well, they already did that, right? They're saying everything, it's the Americans' fault. It's Trump's fault. No, that part I totally agree with you. The only part I think it makes sense to me, at least from a outsider perspective, is the fact that I think the CCP is scared of some of the stuff that Trump is doing. Like, one of the possibilities they raised is like delisting Chinese companies on the U.S. stock exchange. That ties to a lot of the CCP families. And also another thing is the permanent normal trade relationship status that the United States has. If that gets revoked, right, like China has a lot of economic issues. So I just hope, like, at the end of the day, like you mentioned, the messaging isn't going so overboard that it kind of defeats the progress. But I'm also like this, right? I'm like, Chinese people, if they really think that an American president is somehow going to help them end the CCP, I think that's a pipe dream. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it comes down to, like, the United States may be helpful in doing it, but I think it's still the Chinese people that have to do this.
Absolutely,
like whether you're a Trump supporter or you're a Trump hater, I think you should also just stick with the reality that, right, no matter what he says, I don't think we should bank every hope on him or any other president to be like that. So that's my view. And also, I think one point to add on, and I don't know if this is something that you you also notice, but I also think what Trump is doing is try to say this is a trade front, but the CCP doesn't think that way, right?
Yeah,
They take everything, they make it, even if it's economy or trade, it's still part of the politics. So I think at what point does Trump realize that you can't really simply talk economy with China? You have to include the political side. That's also, I think, where he kind of failed in the first part of the trade war in like phase 1 trade deal, right? You know, they were pretty good in the White House. They talk about how the Chinese will buy so much soybeans or whatever product. Then when they go back to China, she is like, okay, well, no, that's not happening. And then they're like, hey, let's release the virus to the world. So I think Trump, like, even if Trump doesn't, think that he's like must do something or other stuff, he should at least realize that, I hope he does realize that China is not somebody who plays by the rules, and everything that you deal with is politics first. So that's my hope.
It's so hard, hey, because it changes almost every day. Because like one day we'll hear them say it's because the Chinese Communist Party has basically rigged the system, world trading system, for decades. Then the next day we hear like, oh, if only they just buy more soybeans, everything's going to be fine. Dude, this is the thing, right? Like the entire American China strategy can't be like just decided on soybeans. Yeah, it can't, right? And yeah, my biggest worry is like, if Trump ends up thinking that he can just go fully alone without the allies and stuff like that, that's the biggest gift to the Chinese Communist Party. Like, if you look at their grand strategy for so long, their grand strategy has always been they want to try split Europe off from America.
Yeah.
And so like that's such a disaster, because this is the thing, right? Like, there's 3 big economic blocks in the world. It's America, Europe, and China.
Yep.
It's just simple common sense that if America and Europe are together, then China, like the Chinese Communist Party, they won't be able to get their way on everything. But if they split them off, like, this is the scary thing, and I'm really worried that there's no grand strategy. It's just chaos, and that's where I had the Cultural Revolution analogy, because like some days you think maybe there is a strategy, and then other times it's like everything's changing every couple hours, and it's just, and then sometimes you get like the really hardcore MAGA guys who like it doesn't even matter what it will be, they'll just support it, right? Like Trump puts the tariffs on, they support it, and then he takes it off 6 hours later, and they're like, God willing, this is it's like we have to have a coherent strategy. It can't just be changing hour by hour. And yeah, dude, I've really appreciated this conversation, because I think it was actually like, I think people who watched it, like if they saw that we're talking together, they would go, oh, it's just 2 China haters. Like, but I think it was actually like, I think we got into like some really interesting, topics. And I think it was like, I think the haters wouldn't realize that it was actually a deeper conversation than they might have thought.
Yeah, well, when they see the titles, like, because actually I've tested this before, where you say something obviously like fake, but the Chinese bots can't detect it, so they think that you're actually agreeing or praising, right? So I think no matter what you're probably like just saying your name would draw a lot of those spam. But I'm happy to do this again. It was a very productive conversation. I love like talking to people who can pick up what I learned, because it also helps me formulate my arguments and ideas better.
I was genuinely so interested listening to your thoughts on like the potential like power dynamics inside basically the power dynamics inside the Kremlin. Like it is really interesting. So like we'll definitely have to do this again sometime. And like I hope that there isn't any craziness, like for example with Taiwan in the weeks or months ahead, because if that happens, like, I mean, we just gotta we got to keep on as analysts and some of the few people in this space, like we really got to like keep on top of it. Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you, man. Thank you so much.